QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021 Homepage Overview. Let's get into it with Intuit. QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Here we are on our desktop. We're going to be opening up QuickBooks, and then we're going to be opening up our data file related to the Get Great Guitars data file. If you have some other data file, then of course you can use some other data file as well as we go through this navigation process. Most people will open up the data file by double-clicking the program and then opening up the data file from there. But note that you can simply open up the data file and then open up the program while double-clicking on the data file in a similar way as most people open up a Word document, double-clicking on the Word document, which then opens up the Microsoft Word program. Let's practice that now by opening up the GGG data file, which is where we stored or housed our actual QBW data file. Then we're going to be opening up the QuickBooks data file, which is where we housed it. And then I'm going to open up the QuickBooks data file. So here's the Get Great Guitars Navigation QBW data file, similar to like a Word document in relation to Microsoft Words, as is the QBW file in relation to the QuickBooks program. Double-clicking on the QBW Get Great Guitars data file will then open up QuickBooks automatically, and QuickBooks will then open to the data file that we have chosen, which of course here is our Get Great Guitars data file that we set up last time. Again, if you have some other data file that you want to open to, any data file is fine right now because we're just going to be taking a look at the flowchart. I have to enter the password here. Our password is going to be GGG for Get Great Guitars 1234. GGG 1234. I wanted to do GGG 123. I think that has a good ring to it, but they wouldn't let me do it. I needed another one, so I had to put a 4 there. But anyways, GGG 1234. I'm gonna close up the balance sheet. I don't need this open, so I'm gonna close this up for now. I'm gonna basically go to the View drop-down. This is what I do every time because I'd like to see the open windows on the left-hand side. So I go to the View drop-down and then Open Windows List. That'll give us our Open Windows list, which all we have open is the home page, which is what we're focusing in on now. To make it large, I'm going to hit this Maximize button. That will maximize it within the pane, within this gray pane. So this gray pane is kind of like our window that we will be operating in. We have similar kind of functionality up top that you would have when dealing with the program itself. For example, these 3 icons are the same. Don't get those 2 things mixed up. Because if you want to close this window and you hit this X, and you want to hit this X, but you hit this X, then you might close the entire program on accident, and you don't want to do that. So remember that within this screen, you have more kind of panes, open windows that you can then view in the Open Windows list to the left. I'm going to maximize this, so now we have our flow chart here. Now the QuickBooks data file can be overwhelming to look at because there's a lot of different areas, a lot of different kind of things to do, obviously, within QuickBooks, within the accounting cycle. So the way you have to break this down in your mind is to break them down. I would break them down by flows, different kind of flows, the normal processes that will be happening. And then once you know the normal processes, then you want to break it down further into the actual items that will take place in those normal processes. And then we'll talk about things that'll be outside of the normal day-to-day data input. So anything that's a normal day-to-day data input that has a normal process, QuickBooks will basically put this into the home page. Now I'm going to minimize this screen to the left by hitting this little triangle, and that'll give us a little bit more room. Also note, if for whatever reason the home page did not open for you, you can always find it by going to the company drop-down and then home page. That'll open up the home page. Now, when you think about the data input into your QuickBooks system, you want to basically kind of categorize how you're going to figure out how to enter the data into the system. If it's a normal day-to-day type of transaction, it will generally fall into one of your 3 kind of flows that we have here: vendors, customers, and employees type of sections. And then within that flow, you'll typically be using one of the forms that will be used. Now you can deviate from these forms and use some other kind of data inputs, such as entering cash transactions directly into the register, but you want to still understand where it's going to fall in the flowchart, because QuickBooks, although you put something into a register, will still basically use these forms to record the transactions. It'll still generate these forms in order to show the transaction. So you want to know the forms so that when you look at the data, it'll make it a lot easier to understand what is happening. So we can break out the day-to-day type of transactions into these forms, And then we can think about the things that are outside the day-to-day type of transactions, and then think about how we're going to be entering those. So basically what you want to do is you want to say, if I'm entering a transaction, does that transaction fit into one of these flows, which it will if it's a normal day-to-day transaction. And if it does, then which form should I use to enter that particular transaction? If it does not fit into the day-to-day transaction, then how do I want to enter it? Typically, if cash is involved, then we'll go to the cash register and use the cash register to enter it. If cash is not involved, then we've got to go to journal entries and use a journal entry, or use the register, which is basically the same thing as entering a journal entry. That's the hierarchy that we will go through. Now, if you have an accounting background, then you've learned debits and credits, and you're always going to be wanting to default to a journal entry. I mean, if you've never used accounting software, and you learned accounting and you learned debits and credits, then that hierarchy is going to bug you, because you're always going to be saying, I don't want to just enter a form. I know the debit and credit. I just want to enter the debit and credit. But in practice, you got to use the forms, because the forms are going to be the things that default the software. So you have to go in that. You really want to get used to going in that order. So you want to say, if there's a form related to it, I want to somehow enter it in such a way so it's going to generate that form in the flow chart that's going to be used within the system. If there's not a form, then I'll typically use the register. If there's not a register, then I'll go to the journal entry, or using a different register other than cash, and that'll be the same thing as a journal entry. That'll be the general process that we go through. So when you think about data input into the system, then the day-to-day data input will typically be broken out into flows, the normal process. And again, you really want to think about things in terms of the flow, the process of not how things are going to happen on date by date overall, but how things are going to happen date by date within a particular cycle. Those cycles will be the vendor cycle, which sometimes will be called the purchasing cycle, or the accounts payable cycle, the payable cycle, maybe the expenses cycle. Those are all the same thing, because they deal with vendors. Basically, they deal with people that we're going to be paying. Vendors are people that we pay. And then we have the customer cycle, which obviously deals with customers. And that's going to be, you can also call it the sales cycle, the accounts receivable cycle, the revenue cycle. So these deal with people that are going to pay us, because these are our customers. And then, of course, we have the employees, which could be called the payroll cycle as well, or the wages cycle, salary cycle, down here. So these are going to be the normal type of processes that we will have. And then within these cycles, then we want to think about the flow chart. And they've got a very nice kind of normal breakout of the flow charts that will typically happen on the homepage, which is really useful. So for the vendor cycle, we will oftentimes be entering the bill. And when we enter the bill, if you think of a standard bill, we'll get the bill, we'll enter the bill, and then we'll pay the bill. And that'll be basically a check that will happen. So we want to then understand the flow that will happen. And then once we know the flow that's going to happen, then we want to tie out these flows to the reports. So once I know the flow, then I want to know the actual forms that are going to happen within that flow. And then when I create these forms, I want to know what that form is going to do to the financial statements, the standard financial statements being the balance sheet and the income statement. So again, if I look at the customer cycle, I'm looking at the flow. What is my flow going to be? And then when I enter my flow, how do these forms fit into that flow? And then when I enter the data into the forms, how do the forms affect the financial statements, standard financial statements being the balance sheet and the income statement? That's what we're always going to be thinking. If we go to the employee cycle, again, what's the data input typical flow that's going to happen? How do I use that flow in terms of the forms? What do the forms look like? And whenever I use one of these forms, these are going to be called forms within the system, then what's that form going to do in terms of the financial statements? What's it going to do to the balance sheet? What's it going to do to the income statement? You can think of that in terms of journal entries. If you're not comfortable with journal entries, you can think about it. At least 2 accounts will be affected with pretty much every form that you will be using here. And you want to know, which 2 accounts are going to be affected, what will be the impact on the financials. As you do that, you will get a better understanding of, what's actually happening, so that you can make changes if changes need to be made. So in future presentations, we're going to go through this section by section: vendors, customers, employees, and we'll go through exactly that, what the flow will be, how that flow might deviate a little bit from company to company, what the forms will be within that flow, and then we'll take a look at those forms individually and think about the data input of those forms and the effect of them on the financials. Now, we won't actually be entering data into these forms. We will do that in the second half of the course when we actually construct a business from scratch and then enter 2 months worth of data. So if you want to go right to the data entry portion, you can go to the second half. And this first half of the course, we're just going to navigate, and we're going to expect to see what these forms do. Now, again, everything that you do within QuickBooks does not fall into these flows, because we might have transactions that aren't normal, like purchasing equipment on account or something like that. It doesn't happen every day. So if you're talking about a transaction that doesn't happen every day, there's not going to be a normal flow for it, and there may not be a form that applies directly to it. That's when we're going to have to move to say, is cash affected? Can I use the cash register? Or if it is not, then I'll default to a journal entry or using some other register, which is basically the same type of thing. So next time we'll move into drilling down on these particular flows and then down into the particular forms within them.